Welcome to my first economics lesson. Today's chapter is utility. It's quite simple, so by the end of this video, you should feel confident about this chapter. In today's lesson, we're going to be discussing utility, total utility, marginal utility, and the law of diminishing marginal utility. So first things first, what is utility? Utility can be defined as the satisfaction that someone gets from consuming a good or service. Pretty straightforward. When you consume a good, you get a certain satisfaction from it, or a certain desire of yours is fulfilled. That's what utility is. Total utility is defined as the total amount of satisfaction derived from the consumption of all units of a good or service within a certain time frame. Simply put, it's the combined utility of multiple units of a good that someone consumes. The graph that you see here shows total utility, and we'll look into that in a bit. Next, marginal utility is the additional utility derived from one more unit of a good. You can also think of it as the amount that one unit contributes to the total utility. Now, to understand the graphs for total and marginal utility, let's look at an example. This here is Bob. Bob was hungry one day, so he decided to buy a bar of chocolate. He could have bought an actual meal, but I won't judge. From this bar of chocolate, Bob receives 10 utils of satisfaction. Util is the unit of measurement for utility. 10 utils means Bob got 10 units of satisfaction. He liked this chocolate bar so much that he decided to buy a second one. This time, his utility goes up to 28 utils. He's really happy right now, so he decides to buy a third chocolate bar. This time, his utility goes up to 38 utils. Keep in mind, I'm referring to total utility here, and we'll look into that in a moment. He buys a fourth bar and goes up to 47. Fifth bar takes him up to 54, and the sixth one takes him to 59. By this point, he's had so much chocolate that he doesn't really like it anymore. Let's take this information and put it in the form of a graph. When Bob had his first bar, his total utility at this point was 15 utils. His marginal utility was also 15 since it was his first bar. After his second bar, his total utility went up to 28 utils. This means the marginal utility for the second bar was 13. For his third bar, he went up to 38, so his marginal utility was 10. Now, how am I calculating marginal utility here? It's pretty simple. You just subtract the total utility for one unit of a good by the total utility after the good consumed before that one. So in this case, I'm subtracting 38, which was the total utility after the third bar, by 28, which was the total utility after the second bar, and that gives me 10. If you know the marginal utility and you're trying to calculate total utility, you would simply add the marginal utility of each unit as you go. Now for the next bar, his marginal utility was 9. For the fifth, his marginal utility was 7, and for the sixth, it was 5. Now I've added another 2 bars just to demonstrate. For the seventh bar, his marginal utility was 0, and for the eighth, his marginal utility was -2. Interesting. It was 15 for his first chocolate bar, and it went all the way down to -2. This, my friends, is what we call the law of diminishing marginal utility. The law of diminishing marginal utility states that each additional unit of a good leads to a smaller amount of marginal utility. The more you consume of a good, the less you enjoy it. Bob really enjoyed his first chocolate bar because he was hungry and it satisfied him. Each bar after that satisfied him less since he'd already been sufficiently satisfied. He then gets so sick of chocolate that he actually starts to become dissatisfied when eating the last bar. Now, if we take the numbers from the table earlier and plot them on a graph, this is what we get. This is Bob's total utility curve. I'll explain the shape in a moment. Here, I've plotted Bob's marginal utility, which diminishes as he consumes more chocolate bars. Now, if we take both of these graphs and put them together, we start to notice some things. They both start at the same point. This is because the total utility after the first chocolate bar was equal to its marginal utility. So the marginal utility and total utility start at the same point. After this point, Bob's marginal utility starts to decrease, but it's still positive, which is why the total utility increases. Remember, marginal utility is the additional utility, and total utility is the sum of marginal utility. That's why total utility is increasing, since marginal utility is still positive and piling up. Then we reach a point where total utility peaks. This is the same point at which marginal utility reaches zero. This is because marginal utility is no longer being added to total utility after this point, so total utility doesn't get any higher than this. This point is also called the point of satiety. Bob is satiated at this point and can no longer receive any more utility. After this point, marginal utility becomes negative. This means it's decreasing the total utility, which is why the total utility curve starts to bend downwards towards the end. We're done with Bob for today, so let's say our goodbyes and move forward. Lastly, we're going to discuss the limitations of the law of diminishing marginal utility. While it does make sense and might apply to many situations, it has some issues with it. Firstly, utility can't easily be quantified. There is no objective form of numerical measurement for satisfaction, and it can vary so much from person to person. If you were to try and put a number on how much satisfaction an apple gives you, you would probably struggle to do so. Next, the law assumes that consumers are rational, which is not always the case. Someone might have an addiction, so they wouldn't have diminishing marginal utility. Instead, they might have constant or even increasing marginal utility. Another situation might be if you have an emotional attachment to a certain good, like a certain meal. You might not experience diminishing marginal utility in that case. Next, the law assumes that all units of a commodity are homogeneous. Homogeneous means different units of a good are identical. Once again, this is not always the case. Realistically, there's most likely going to be some sort of variation between units, like how there might be slight differences in taste of different units of a food. This could potentially make the law inaccurate in cases where goods aren't homogeneous. Lastly, the law might not apply to durable goods. Durable goods are goods that are consumed over a longer period of time multiple times, as opposed to, let's say, a banana, which you'd eat and it's gone. Examples of durable goods are phones, clothing, tools, etc. These goods don't really have a set time frame or different units for their consumption, so it can be very inaccurate and difficult when trying to pinpoint their marginal utility. Therefore, it doesn't always apply in their case. So that was all for this lesson. I hope you learned something, and I'll be back very soon with my next one. I'll see you then.